Hello, Jay Michaelson.
Hello, Will Sylvia Fisher.
Yes, straight from the studios of CNN to Queerly Beloved.
I don't know how many people have made that exact pilgrimage, but if I'm the first,
You
I
are
won't be the
certainly the
last.
first. You are certainly the first. Yeah, perhaps the
No,
last.
no Anderson yet.
No, Anderson, no, but he's on the list. I'm sure he wants to come in here and talk about being queer and spiritual and all his fun woo-woo
He does
beliefs.
actually, every so often he gives an interview that he does want to talk about those things.
Does he? He has like
Yeah,
a spiritual, yeah,
yeah, yeah,
cool.
yeah.
Okay.
He's a meditator, and
Mm.
he's another like me, dad late in life, and
Hmm.
that's its own spiritual practice. Yeah,
Beautiful. I'm putting him on my list of dream guests. But you are also on that list, my friend, and I'm so grateful for you for making this time.
thank you. It really is fun to hang out again.
Yeah.
It's been a long
And
time.
I so enjoyed the book, and it's beautiful, by the way. The listeners won't be able to see this, but anyone who watches the YouTube will. The cover is so cool. It
Let me
reminded me a
tell
little bit of Morning Story, of
Oh,
the
I like
morning
that.
show, the morning
I
show.
was curious if the lines evoke anything for you.
What was interesting, Jay, is that I didn't see the lines until
Uh-huh.
like 2 months after starting to read it.
Huh.
And then I suddenly was like, ooh, the lines. And it took a whole new dimensionality. Um, to me, it evoked like a playfulness because it almost seemed like maybe you had your daughter draw them, you
Hmm,
know?
interesting. Uh-huh.
So I felt like a childlike wonder of connection of like bringing things into a weaving connected way.
I
So,
love that. I feel like this is just a Rorschach test. Those lines, like people have very different reactions. If you want,
mm.
I'm gonna maybe ruin it for you. A lot of people say they kind of look like pubic hairs.
Oh, I see that now.
Yeah, and there is a lot of sexual themes, a lot of sexual themes in the stories. That
Mm,
was not the intention of the artist, David Ben Harosh, is a very talented artist. It was
mm,
just meant to feel very hand drawn, and
mm,
the lines don't all connect in the same way. So it's kind of a metaphor for queerness, but some people see it
mm,
as more earthy. But I love that you
mm,
didn't actually. I love your version of it.
mm. Yeah, it's also giving me so for the reader, I mentioned the morning show because the morning show intro has all those like circles coming and spinning. The book cover has these beautiful circles of different colors, and that is also giving me like chakras, kind of like
Yeah,
a
it's meant to be the tree of life, the Sphirot, and
mm,
which they're it's similar in certain ways to the chakras. And each of those colors, the Sphirot are actually associated with different colors, these different potencies of or energies. And so we kind of use the traditional ones, but also queered it up a little bit.
love it. Love it. All right, we're getting ahead of ourselves. So I want to ask you the first question I ask all my guests on Queerly Beloved, which is, who are you in this moment? But tell me by describing the perfect drag avatar that embodies that. Feel free to take a couple breaths and ask yourself that question and reply when you're ready.
So since I practiced this before we started, my answer is already front of heart and mind. So what I like about my drag avatar is that she is nameless and ineffable like the divine herself,
Mm,
because she would be based on Barbara Streisand, who is the sort of neurotic Jewish multi hyphenate person as an inspiration for me.
mm,
We have different hyphens, and my talent, of course, is not doesn't register on the Richter scale of Barbara. But what I love about her is that, as you and I were talking before we started, there's not really a drag name. Maybe some listeners could send some in. That would
yes.
actually solve for 20 years. I've been thinking if I was to do a drag character, her name would be based somehow on Barbara Streisand, and I just never came up with it, even though the word bra is like right in there. So you'd think
Mm,
like you could do something with that. But I
mhm.
love that my drag avatar is, a kind of controlling Jewish woman on the one hand and ineffable and nameless on the other.
Perfect.
That
Have you
is
been
the two sides of me
Yes, I see that. I see that.
encapsulated.
I love that. Have you been paying attention to, is it a book that she came up with out with recently?
Yeah, I think it's a memoir, right? I
A
believe.
memoir,
Yeah.
yeah. Have
Yeah.
you been checking that out or seeing any of the
I have
interviews?
not. I have read some reviews of the
Mm,
memoir, and I saw some interview with James Brolin actually about it and about her.
Mhm.
But and it was interesting. I struggle with, switching to your like coaching persona for a moment. I struggle with not quite regret or envy, but comparing, let's just say.
Mhm.
And it was fascinating to read Barbara say that she was asked about her film career, and she felt like, she said, I've never really fulfilled my potential.
Wow.
And a friend of mine who I think is also like a gay spirit person, Dan Callahan, wrote this book about kind of the golden age of American song. So Barbara, Frank Sinatra, people like that, Ella Fitzgerald.
Mm.
And he said he actually had agreed. It was interesting, like she's obviously, no one could debate her genius, as a singer, as a musician. But it's true, she's had these amazing performances as an actor. But you always wonder if there might have been even more. And so it's just
Mm.
interesting to see somebody still on that level at this stage of her life reflect back and actually think, I wonder I could have done more there. So I found
Mm.
that inspiring as well.
Yeah, absolutely. To see someone of that caliber, and I would include you in such a high caliber, to regard yourself and ask, "Oh, I haven't quite accomplished what my highest potential is." It is, I feel, comforting, especially for those of us who tend to compare ourselves to the success of others, to see that someone of such high caliber would be also questioning that. And I think the question that it brings up for me is really, what is one's highest potential, and is there ever really a meeting of it? Right? It's
Mm.
almost like this thing that we just keep expanding into and expanding into and trying to reach, but is it actually reachable? It's sort of like a performance. Is it ever perfect? It's always perfect in its process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that. I mean, I think it's clear. I was talking with I'm friend. I guess I'll say him by name. I'm friends with Dan Harris, who's this best-selling author and really has changed the world of meditation in the United States. And
Mm,
he was doing that also. Like, oh, I feel like I could get high, this next potential. And it's always been clear to everybody, I think, that like, wherever you are, you tend to look up and you don't
mhm,
look quote unquote down, which is, of course, this isn't even a vertical metaphor. It's really just horizontal, right? You don't look side to side and be like, well, yeah, I was there and now I'm here, I'm doing this, I'm doing that. There's this tendency to verticalize it and
mhm,
like, oh, I'm climbing the mountain and, maybe one day I'll be as famous as this person or as, as happy or as wealthy or as what, spiritually
mhm,
advanced. And obviously it happens in the spiritual world too. We set up people
mhm,
in there. Sometimes that's good to set up paragons or let's say role models, but then we compare ourselves. I compare myself unfavorably to them. But yeah, I've luckily on the spiritual side, I've been privileged to meet so many of these like amazing teachers,
mm,
and the neurosis is almost always still there, in some
mm.
degree. And so there's always like it's one of the things that I'm sure you've encountered. I'm curious if you've encountered this, but I feel like you must have, where like it's easier to teach or preach than it is to actually practice, right? Where we're like, yeah, quite, hold your inner critic with compassion, but don't believe them, and see
Mhm.
that that voice may have been trying to save you or protect you, but no longer serves you. I mean, I can talk the talk really well on
Mm.
that, but walking the walk is a different story.
Yeah, absolutely. It's always this reminder of the relationship with that inner judgment, that inner critic. It is rarely about getting them to completely leave the party. It's about how you get to be with them and perhaps the strategies you create to be in better relationship with them. And part of that is accepting that they are at the party and probably going to be there for maybe your whole life, and that might be
It's funny.
okay.
It's funny with that image. The first thing that came to mind was like some person at the party who I want to like lock in the bathroom, which is not the kind of relationship we want to create to this critical voice. But
Right.
just like, actually, I was just sitting with a meditation teacher named Locke Kelly, and he was having us do this practice where we bring up some difficult material and like just a part of ourselves that we're judging or something like that,
Mm.
and then try to enter a space of a really expanded mind. And he had all these prompts to do that, remembering some peak experience and inhabiting the consciousness that you had at that time, just, kind of almost play acting your way into your higher self in a way.
Mm.
And the thing was like, well, how does this mind, how does this heart regard this part, it was a little bit internal family systemsy, right? This part of you. And my immediate response, without thinking in my brain what I was supposed to say, was, it hates it. I hate it. And this was a clue that I was not actually in touch with that. It was so funny because I was doing the practice that he had said, and I was like sitting there grooving out and like getting into the zone. But then when the push came to shove, the prompt was like, okay, well, how can you relate to that part? No, I was not in my quote unquote awake awareness, or I forget his exact language.
And I appreciate the honesty of that, that it wasn't coming up in this like fake voice, that you were actually being real with where you were at in that moment. Yeah. And going back to these spiritual leaders, these folks who hold such high vibrations that often we look up to, and remembering that they are human too. I recently watched this speech by Ram Dass, who was telling a story, and yeah, all his neuroses were in there too. And it was a story about a spiritual moment that he was having. And it's just so helpful to have those folks humanized, to remember that we're all on this path together. We're all,
absolutely,
keeping it all in balance.
Anyone who has all the answers, that's the person not to believe.
Yes. So I'm excited to talk about the book. Before we do, I kind of just want to give some backstory around our relationship. And specifically, I want to just mention and thank you for the Passover dinners, the queer Passover dinners that I had the pleasure of being a guest at in Brooklyn. And, just want to express how much those meant to me to get to be in that circle and have that experience.
Thank you. Yeah, we did. We're still doing them. I've left Brooklyn. I have a 6-year-old daughter, and we've moved to a nice cozy house outside of the city, and we're very happy with that. But we did go. I schlepped in all of the stuff last year into Brooklyn. We're still holding those. So thank you. That means a lot that it stays with you after all this time.
Yeah, there was always such a beautiful mix of these deep spiritual moments and these traditions that were weaved together so beautifully, where I felt like I was connecting to something that had this incredible breadth of history, and doing it in this way that resonated with me as a queer person in this queer community.
Thanks. Well, you said you was like before we get to the book, but that's what the book is trying to do too. So that was your
thank you.
That really is that, this book makes use of very deep wells of mysticism and tradition, and hopefully not too deep to be penetrable by people not already immersed. But it's I don't know, can I say queer as fuck on the podcast? I don't know.
Queer,
I mean, that's the goal, is to really queer it, not just in the sense of like, here's some queer characters, but really queering a mystical tradition in a fictional form. It was super liberating for me. So I'm still at the queer Seder.
Beautiful. Could you share a little bit about about Jewish mysticism?
Sure. I think there's sort of a conception of mysticism that it's about having an experience, getting to a place where you can have some experience, and that experience is union with the divine or with the universe, or however we conceptualize that. There is a little of that in the Jewish mystical tradition, but most of it is not actually about that. And it's a different form of mystical and esoteric speculation, experience, writing, and even art. And it's much more about the relationship of the one to the many. So less about having that experience just of oneness, and actually having kind of more of experiences of multiplicity, of these different energies, the 10 sefirot, or emanations of the divine, or these sort of energies that are in our body. Again, it is there are a lot of points of contact with the chakras. Some people say they're even, there must be something historically in common because they're so similar. I don't know about that, but there's definitely a lot of interesting. I think they're looking at the same human, physical, and spiritual form. That's why they're similar. So similarly, these different energies that are embodied, but are also on an emotional and a spiritual and an intellectual level as well. And it's also for that reason, because it's about this kind of dynamic organization, this secret organization of reality. It's also very erotic in the larger sense of the word erotic. So about eros, about desire and yearning and consummation, and sometimes in the narrower sense too. And there's a lot of interesting Kabbalah on sexuality. In its traditional form, they're very concerned with like all the energies flowing in a very particular way. And I'm not so, and that includes like the gender binary, and it includes heteronormativity, and so it's masculine, feminine. There are in these 10 energies, these 10 sefirot, they're gendered in multiple ways, and there's some that are have both male and female, which is as close as we'll get to sort of a non-binary conception in that system. And there's actually a whole reservoir of queer stuff within the Kabbalah. But I wanted with this work of fiction to really go a little further and really explore where it collides with different queer realities. And, ultimately, I mean, the book is called The Secret That Is Not a Secret. And it's ultimately a lot about this tension, this productive tension between the real and the unreal or the unseen, and different ways that plays out. Not that one is, the right thing and the other is the wrong thing, but there are different ways in which that plays out for these characters struggling with desire, with yearning, with a real spiritual yearning. So that's like a really funny intro to Kabbalah, to Jewish mysticism, but I think it does for now.
Yeah, no, that's beautiful. That's super helpful. And yeah, I'm interested to talk more about these places of collision. I like how you called that. They collide together. And, just in, I think one of the first stories, the one about the beard, one of the things that I was taken aback by was, and I wasn't planning to bring this up, so I don't have it highlighted, but the husband talked about wanting to pleasure his wife, and that being something that was ordained, or that was something that was, and I'm just curious, is that true, that in sort of
that is true? Yeah.
Wow, that was really shocking to me.
Yeah, there are a couple of there are some sects that are more pro-sex than others. I'd say that 10 times fast. But in normative Jewish tradition, the overwhelming majority of Orthodox Jews, ultra-Orthodox Jews, right? Yeah, the husband has a religious obligation to give his wife pleasure.
Wow.
And again, that's not universal, but it's also seen. Sometimes you might have heard. Well, I don't know if you've heard. There's a funny thing which people sometimes hear about, like having sex as a double mitzvah, which means like a double commandment or double good deed on Shabbat, on Friday night, and that's really when the best sex happens in those communities. And it's a double because one, it's a commandment to be fruitful and multiply, right? But the other is to have joy on the Sabbath. And this is a great way to have joy on the Sabbath. So one act gets you double the mitzvah points. You've done two things that you're supposed to do. And yeah, it's a very, it's complicated. And I say that I have a nonfiction article called Queer Kabbalah, or Queer Kabbalah and Queer Theology. And on the one hand, I don't want to sugarcoat, right? I mean, this is still in its traditional frame, very conservative. It's entirely heteronormative. It's about monogamous relationships between a man and his wife and so on. And yet, if you can kind of get into that frame, within that frame, it's quite remarkable. And it is in its way sex positive, and it is very juicy and rich. And there's love songs, erotic love songs between God and people, and sometimes the man, that's because it's male, it's a patriarchy, right? The men are doing the praying and the writing of the prayers, but they take on the feminine role relative to the divine. Sometimes the divine takes on the feminine role. So there's a lot of potentially liberating potential within this body of tradition.
Yeah, it's so fascinating because from the outside you would anticipate, Orthodox Jewish culture, for example, to just be so steeped in puritanical ideas and ideals. And so to read that, I was like, oh, wow, there is some stuff that's underneath the surface here. And I think that was a lot of what was coming through in the book for me, was realizing that in these ancient traditions, that it's not all about puritanical ideals, and that these these thoughts and beliefs that I hold as a queer spiritual person around the divinity and sacredness of sexuality and pleasure, for example, and eros, that these are also shared by, the Hasids that I see in Williamsburg.
It
Like,
is,
that was
yeah. I mean,
really,
again, just to not sugarcoat it, right? It's within for them, it's within certain boundaries.
yes.
But yeah, no, you're right, and it's not just the Hasidic Jews or the Orthodox Jews. It's also in Islam. Part of
Mm,
the covering up of women's bodies, not wanting to minimize the tragedy of that,
sure.
but also part of it is meant to be like, yeah, because then when they're uncovered, it's this very erotic
Mm,
thing between man and wife. And also you see
wow.
similar things sometimes in Hinduism as well.
Mm,
Yeah, there's not the anti-sexual paranoia that you find certainly in some forms of conservative Christianity.
yeah. Mhm.
And that draws, it's just based on what the traditions are that they're rooted in, and their assumptions about the body and the spirit and how those may or may not be related. And
Mm,
so yeah, there was only so far I could really go writing nonfiction about this material. So for
mhm.
listeners who don't know, I've written 8 books of nonfiction plus 1 book of poetry, and it wasn't like I didn't want to do a theology or something like that. It felt like the form of these interlocking stories, um, and fiction in general. That just felt like the way to tell this story was to tell stories.
Yeah. They're such fascinating and fun stories too. So, yeah, going back to this idea of finding some of the, what I would call queer spirituality within these traditional religions, I'm curious what your thoughts are on that distinction between spirituality and religion, and particularly in the context of how that has impacted LGBTQ folks, who so many that I know in the LGBTQ community have rejected spirituality because of the negative impacts of religion, of organized
Mm.
religion.
Hmm.
And it's sad because there are some real golden threads that weave through both religion and spirituality when we take the time to discover them, right? As I was able to see in this book, for example. I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think following. So I've worked on this in an academic context, for my graduate work. I think religion is almost impossible to separate from something around like institutional religion or societal
Mhm,
structures, and
mhm,
spirituality by its nature is open to a kind of experience that might be destabilizing, right? It might
mhm.
take you out of your box, out
Yeah.
of your identity, in perhaps in relationship with others or perhaps on your own, but it takes you out of that zone, and there's some kind of transformation that's possible, and that's
Mm,
found in religion and at the same time in tension with religion, which is often about setting up social structures and
mm.
creating structures whereby people, for better or for worse, are organized. And sometimes often for worse in the case of patriarchy, or in a lot of other cases as well. Um, so for me, yeah, I've come out the other end of having
Mm,
rejected religion. I was able to kind of re-embrace it in a certain way, but I don't have any, or I try not to put any stock, or these characters in this book are much more traditional than I am.
mhm,
And it was funny where it's not true in all of the stories, right? I mean, there's a couple of characters who are a lot like me and who are in a contemporary space, but there's a sort of tension which as a writer was just very appealing about these more traditional characters who were still to some degree or another trapped,
mhm,
within those structures, and yet they're feeling this call to the transcendent.
mhm,
And that to me, or a call to the immanent, the call to maybe what's right in front of us.
mm,
And that to me is that tension, the spirituality religion tension,
mm,
that there's these structures and forms, like this is the way it goes, it channels in this way, in this direct way, and this one and no other one. And
mm,
then like those lines on the cover, that's
mm.
just not how it is. It's not how
Yes.
it is. It goes in all kinds of directions. And nature itself is very queer, and in the sense of not conforming to simple binaries or simple accounts,
Mhm,
of that this is how it is. So
mm.
that's the joy of it.
Beautiful. Yeah, that's really helpful. So I want to talk, going back to these collisions, I want to talk about I would call it more of a mixing than a collision, but the mixing of the purification of water and then the
Mm,
eros of being naked or bathing in water with
mm.
another in the mikvah of Ben Sirah. And this one particularly I connected with because one of my, actually, yes, my first queer erotic experience was in a hot tub. And
Oh,
in fact, the first blowjob I
not the
ever
hot tub
gave,
that you and I were in. You were already
no,
an
not
old
Easton
queen by
Mountain.
then.
No, I was I was in grade school. Yeah, for our history, Jay Michaelson and have had this interview relationship once before in a hot tub at Easton Mountain where I had him on my show Tub Talks back in the day. No, it was not that hot tub, but it was the hot tub of my parents' house when I
Mm.
was in grade school. And yeah, and I gave my first blowjob under the water. And
Wow,
so
which is pretty
the
impressive for like a young kid to do just the mechanics, forgetting about
yeah.
the great sexual awakening, just
Mm,
managing to accomplish that task. Good for you.
thanks. Yeah, it required a lot of breath control, I
Yeah,
suppose.
breathwork. See, that's why you're so into breathwork now. Just calls you back to that primal moment.
That's right. But yeah, there is something that I really love to connect in terms of this fluidity and almost like innocence of water with eros and sexuality. And so I really felt that in that particular story.
Thanks. Yeah. Yeah, I mean that story is set. So uh, that's that has some autobiographical element, not the fun
Oh.
part, unfortunately, but it's set with an Orthodox Jewish man who has this practice of going to the mikveh, which is like a ritual bath
Mm,
once a week, and in some communities, it's only that practice is only done by women who go to they
okay.
go to the mikveh after the end of the menstrual cycle, and that quote unquote purifies them to then be able to have sex with their husbands.
Mm,
But in many communities, men also go. And he adopts this practice, and he's still quite closeted and self hating about his own sexuality. And so for him, I think he, if I remember my own phrase, he
mm,
describes it as like the expression and self abnegation of his sexuality at the same time.
mm,
So it's like he's in this space with other naked men. It's gender segregated, the mikveh, so it's only other men, and it's often before, that was based on my experience going to the mikveh in Jerusalem when I lived there.
mm,
It can get a little crowded before the
mm.
Sabbath comes in on a Friday afternoon, and so you really are like you're right in there with like a whole bunch of naked men. You have to go into the mikveh completely naked,
Wow.
and yet at the same time it's charged with that eros. It's also this place where he does this purification practice because he thinks of his erotic expression as sinful
Mhm.
and is in need of purification. And I won't do a spoiler for the for what happens in the second
Mm,
part of the story, but maybe some of those lines get crossed in a provocative way.
mm,
And that was my experience. The very first draft of these stories was written, gosh, that one actually goes way back. It's almost 15, 20 years ago.
mm,
And I was just in a different place in my own journey. And when I first had those experiences at the mikvah, again, not the fun one that's in the book,
mm,
but yeah, I was still in the closet. It was in the 90s, the early 90s
mm.
before I came out. And it was this heated, compressed experience of
Mm,
being in this kind of, it's not hypersexualized, nobody's having sex, but it is hyper eroticized.
mhm,
This is me at age like 21, 22.
mhm.
And so not that much older from where we sit now, not that much older from your experience in the hot
Mhm,
tub at the time, of course, that 5 years difference, that's an eternity. But now,
mhm.
anyway, so this is
Yeah,
me as,
sure.
quite young, and having that experience um, of simultaneously experiencing one's sexuality and rejecting it at the same time.
Mm. And purifying
Right.
that, right?
You're right.
Purifying.
He feels a real release. That character feels a real release in the
Mm,
mikveh, as I did. And it's such a trap in a way. Like you don't, it's like when you feel release, what you really need to be released from is the idea that there's something to be released from,
yeah.
right? That's like part of the secret. That's not a secret, right? It's like,
Mm,
but when you feel release, you're like, oh, I'm released. It's great. This is
mhm,
perfect. Everything is great. But you're still, but as long as you're in that zone of I'm being
yeah.
released or I'm being purified, you're still in prison.
Yeah. You're fooling yourself. Yeah. It makes
Well,
me
yeah, and
think
you're
of,
like deluding yourself that there is a prison,
yes.
right? Like there has to be this line,
Yes.
that beyond this line is forbidden, and on this
Mm.
side is permitted. And you can, by going back and forth, like I was, I'm trying to think of, I guess it's like Amazing Grace or something, right? I was sinful, right? I was blind, but now I can see. You go back and forth, you go back and forth.
Mm-hmm.
That back and forth is itself the problem. So even
Mm-hmm.
the experience of liberation can contribute to our servitude.
Wow. That's deep. Hmm. Yeah. I'm like taking that one in. Yeah. So a couple things. Like one is that it's like keeps you stuck in neutrality in a sense,
Mm.
right? That you can never really expand into something greater. You can't really ever find that transcendence. You can't find that, like you said, that true liberation when you're stuck in that paradigm, when you're stuck in that story. Mm. But yeah, it also relates to the binary, right? The servitude, like it's stuck in that as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think I hold out a little hope for liberation for that character, and the hope that the
Mhm.
experience that he does have
Mhm.
in the mikveh might transform him.
Mhm.
But I deliberately didn't. Well, I didn't want to determine that.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's true. And actually, there's a little thing. This is a little bit of a spoiler, but that character. One of the things I loved doing that was just fun was weaving the stories together.
Mm.
And that character kind of appears in a later story, and he's married a woman.
Mm. Yes.
He has not actually maybe learned, but maybe that is kind of a spoiler because you don't really. I tried to not hit the reader over the head with that. It's just mentioned
Mm.
briefly that this character had this name and this background,
Mm.
and but yeah, there's a. I didn't want it to be just happy endings.
Yeah.
No pun intended.
That's hilarious. So let's move on to another one that I found really provocative, which was the verse. And well, yeah, I'll just say quickly that when we're talking about the verse, we're talking about, and with a man you shall not lie as with a woman. It's an abomination. And so want to just describe what happens with that verse in this story?
Sure. So it starts out with the character kind of lying in bed. We're not sure if he's awake or asleep. Not sure if it's real or a dream. And he hears that this verse has been magically erased from every handwritten Torah scroll on the planet. And just by way of background, this is to be an official Torah that's used for ritual purposes and services. It has to be handwritten on parchment. So it's actually a very time-consuming activity. It's also very expensive,
Mm.
and but that's what makes it a real one, as opposed to just a book or something like that.
Mhm.
And so this magical thing happens, and the story then becomes kind of panoramic, looking at different characters all around the world and how they're relating to it joyfully or
Mhm.
tearfully, and trying to and wrestling with it in various different ways. And finally, it's funny. I'll tell you the original version of this, and then I changed it in a way that I think
Mm.
you'll like. In the original version, so the story ends. There's this again another closeted figure who's praying ardently and to God to have this verse removed from the Torah, like just make it disappear, and then I can be fully faithful and serve you. He wants to have that religious / spiritual life, but he feels shut out from it. And in the original version, like that prayer rises up to heaven, and that's what accomplishes this deed. But I just didn't like that enough. And so the current version, as you know,
Mhm.
has this like radical fairy pagan ritual. It's not named as radical fairies, but it's obviously based on
Mhm.
the Beltane ritual and radical fairy sanctuary.
Mhm.
Obviously, to those who know what that is, and yeah, people are dancing around the maypole, and some are naked, and some are, in some kind of orgiastic expression or something. And it's the
Mhm.
combination, the union, I would say, the sexual union of that sort of earth energy
Mhm.
channeled up through the goddess. And pardon me for being a little heteronormative here, but that goddess energy
Mhm.
uniting with the male god energy
Mhm.
of that person praying, and it's that
Mhm.
magic, the earth magic meeting the sky, that affects this magical transformation.
Mm.
And that for me felt more Yeah, that's the ending I wanted.
It was so juicy. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm
Yeah.
glad you experienced it as juicy.
We even got into description of the drag too. They were arrayed in
That's right.
robes and leather and jewels.
I
Yeah.
love when readers read stuff and pick up the different that, like, I don't know what other readers are going to hone in on the drag the way you just did, but of course you would. That's great. I just love that. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that lit me up and actually really took me right back to moments that I've experienced with you around the maypole at
Mm.
rituals. And I'm curious, going down that little rabbit hole for a bit, how has your experience of radical fairy rituals and being in that space and perhaps we'll throw Burning Man into this umbrella too, these spaces of radical self-expression and ritual opportunities. How have those spaces impacted your spirituality and the way that you commune with spirit?
Thanks for asking that question. The short answer is profoundly.
Mm.
But I think one thing that I've noticed in my work is, like, I've written a lot about Judaism and I've written a
Mm.
lot about Buddhism. These are two
Mhm.
of the three spiritual traditions that are really my root traditions. And I have not written or done as much with what I would loosely group as earth-based religious
Mhm.
traditions. Some might call them pagan, which is fine. I'm fine with that term, or whatever and so for radical fairy stuff, for the spiritual sides of Burning Man, also in closer to the Jewish tradition, there's all kinds of earth-based Judaism that's focused on the
Mhm.
shamanic. Also psychedelics. I actually have a new, because I collect titles. I know I'm
Mhm.
affiliated now with the Emory Center for Psychedelics and Spirituality, doing sort of scholarly work on that intersection.
Mhm.
And it's I think it's no coincidence that, like, as I've settled into a little bit more of a householder lifestyle, with literally having a house and having a kid
Mhm.
and living that life, I really felt like there was something missing in the way my writing is or isn't reflecting my own spirituality.
Mhm.
And this book is by far the most pagan, by far the most psychedelic, by far the juiciest and magic
Mhm.
oriented of anything I've written. And I think on the surface it may appear, it's not very Buddhist, which is fine. That's fine. So on the surface it may appear very Jewish,
Mhm.
and then it is. I'm not, like, running away from that, but there is, like, this constant current in most of the stories of
Mhm.
of the real, of the earth,
Mhm.
of the four elements in this body, of the body, sometimes in tension with, sometimes in union with whatever we call the spirit. And so that for me was like, and I think there's more work I want to do in that. There's also, like, a lot of smart people and a lot of smart queer people have already done a lot of interesting writing. And, like, I'm mostly thinking of in terms of writing, because I mean I do a little visual art, music, and whatever, but, like,
Mhm.
words are where I'm at. And so I've been struggling to, like, find, like, what's my contribution. But this was
Mhm.
one at this intersection of queerness, paganism, and Jewish mysticism. There's not a
Mhm.
lot at that particular corner. And
Mhm.
that's the corner where I live. And it felt like there was
Mhm.
this segues back to stuff again. I'm sure you tell your clients all the time that, like, and Rick Rubin tells his clients all the time, right? That, creativity is like expressing this unique, like, what's my unique voice? And I
Mhm.
really felt like I found a part of my voice that I hadn't been using
Mhm.
with this work, with this book.
Mhm.
And so I love that. I didn't even answer the question after saying I loved it, but for me to answer the question, not about the book, it's just been an essential piece
Mhm.
of this. And it's weird to have, I like that I have these three as opposed to two, because binaries kind of suck, and so at
Mhm.
least I have the multiplicity.
Mhm.
But all three for me interrelate. I mean, for
Mhm.
me, a spirituality, even forms of Buddhism, even American Buddhism, can be a little down on the body sometimes,
Mhm.
and that for me just doesn't reach my experience of the spiritual. I mean, one of my most profound experiences gosh, when was that? 2003 or four, somewhere like that, like almost 20 years ago, was in Body Electric, right? Which, we know, you and I know well, listeners may not, combining erotic massage and breath work, and sometimes with a very clear kind of spiritual intention, sometimes with an intention of healing. Not that those are different, but, and there are a lot of intentions one could have. For me, it was feeling the same kind of closeness to the sacred in that experience as I had felt at some of my peak experiences on silent meditation retreats.
Wow. Yeah.
And it was like different but similar, but it was like coming home in this very embodied way to an experience that I'd previously had, just in like after 5 or 6 days of silent meditation. And I was crying on the table. There's a lot of crying on those tables, Body Electric. But for me, it was that healing that it wasn't like, for me, again, this was 20 years ago. So a different point in my journey. It wasn't like accommodating, I wrote this book, God versus Gay. It wasn't like accommodating God and gay. It was like seeing that they're on the same team, that like, that our full expression as sexual beings contributes to and is informed by and enriches our full expression as spiritual beings. Like, it wasn't like, well, I have this and I also have that, and I somehow have to people often, even now, like when I get booked to do some LGBT stuff, like it's like reconciling religion and sexuality. And if that's the framework people are, fine, that's fine. But that's not, it's not like reconciling. It's like, these are the two of the ingredients in the stew, and one without the other feels out of balance for me. So like, it's not only sex, it's also nature, it's also the earth, it's also the body, and it's pleasure. This is what I have learned from the Radical Fairies, Burning Man, Body Electric, and Easton Mountain, where we used to teach together. And yeah, I'm just so grateful for that. And it's been a while since that was like the growing edge. There's always edges, I think, right? But that, I've like I said, I feel like that part of me has been absent from some of my artistic work, and so it feels really good to have it out in this new collection.
Yeah, and it is wonderful to receive it, and I'm excited that it from that answer, it sounds like this is the beginning of more of that, and I want to celebrate and wish for more of that, because it is juicy, and it's particularly a lens that I really resonate with, this Buddhist, mystical, Jewish, earth-based paganism, but all through a queer lens. It's unique and exciting and juicy, and it definitely lights me up.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that feels great. Thank you.
Yeah. So more, please. More, please.
It's funny on like the seemingly polar opposite, but I'm going to bring it together. I have this journalism career, and last night I was on TV talking about a ridiculous moment in the Congress that happened, where like there was a U.S. senator and a witness in a hearing who's the head of the Teamsters union, and they almost came to blows, literally. And the Teamsters guy had trash talked the senator on Twitter like a few months ago. They hate each other for a long time, and like meanwhile in the background is this whole important clash about capitalism, because the senator is a business owner and is a multimillionaire, probably worth about $75 million. And the Teamsters guy is like, you're a corrupt boss, F you, et cetera, et cetera. And it literally, these two men, grown men, one of whom is a senator, the other is the president of the most powerful union, or one of the most powerful unions in the country, were like schoolyard children. And for me, it was just this moment of like totally just dysfunctional masculinity. I feel like the phrase toxic masculinity is like almost dead. It's been so overused.
Sure.
This was just like pathetic masculinity, right? It was literally, and the phrase they each used was like, he said, the senator said to the other guy, like, you said you anytime, anywhere, anytime, any place. Well, this is a time, this is a place. Let's go right now. And the other guy goes, you want to go right now? And the senator's like, yeah, stand your butt up, like get out of the chair. And then the other guy says, you stand your butt up. This is verbatim, because I was just on the news. I read it. Like that's and it's funny, like we're talking, like it just it's like the wound and this just the inability to like see sexuality as anything other than this like penis domination, control, power, fight the other dude. And, obviously American masculinity is in a kind of crisis right now. That's why there's been this rise of like crazy hyper masculine,
Mhm.
often rapey, people, whether it's
Mhm.
Trump or whether I forget that guy's name is in jail in Romania, or Jordan Peterson or others. Like there's this like rise in toxic masculinity as a response to this gender
Mhm.
crisis where there's liberation of women, liberation of queer people. And it's
Mhm.
like, so it's funny, like what we were just talking about was like cool, like the best, like our favorite forms of spirituality.
Mhm.
And yet for me, it's like juxtaposed with like, here's this example of what happens when you don't have that integration.
Mm. Yeah. Well, I'm glad that you can chat about that stuff on CNN last night and then come here and talk about this
That's
stuff plus
peak J.
plus blowjobs and hot tubs. Um,
That was you, for the record.
that was me for the record.
Right wing haters of Jay who picked that up. I feel like they're gonna need to go like way into the deep research. If I ever get like infamous enough, they'll be like, "We found willfully living."
Yeah, a tub talk, I would imagine.
Well, I kept my clothes on for that one,
That's
remember? Because
right.
then
I
I was
remember that.
actually
That's
more
right.
sensitive to my haters. That was right after God versus
Mm,
Gay. And that book was
mm,
like meant to be a kind of mainstream book. And I did have haters, right, who were
mm.
trying to like devalue. And I was like, I just don't want to be like naked in the hot tub on YouTube, even with the bubbles on.
Well, I don't
Now
think
that I know this history of you in hot tubs, maybe that was.
The mikvah. Well, Jay, as we wrap things up, any final words of wisdom you want to share with the listeners?
No, this was super. I am, I guess, I should try to do some marketing, which is that I did launch a new Substack newsletter recently,
Yes.
jmichaelson.substack.com, but you could just Google
Mm.
me in Substack. And it's a lot. It's a lot about the intersection of politics and spirituality.
Mm.
So it's like this and just like with that little rant I
Yeah.
just went on, where we see what looks like a kind of political moment, but I think actually is deeply connected to some spiritual failings and
Mhm.
opportunities for growth, if we wanted to put it positively.
Mhm.
And so I'm excited about that. And the book, I think by the time this drops, will be out. It's being published December 5th, 2023.
So,
And I'm just very excited about having it out. A little nervous too. I'm not sure
mm,
like how the sex scenes in the mikveh or whatever will go over with some of my,
mm,
you know, fans, but
mm.
it feels in a little way like yet another coming out,
Wow.
to be able to share this side with a wider
Mhm.
audience.
Wow. Well, thanks for your courage.
Thanks.
Yeah, and I'll have all that in the show notes so people can easily access that. And yeah, Jay, this has been a total pleasure, and I'm just so grateful to know you.
Thank you so much, Will. Likewise.
Thank you.